There we go. All right. Good evening, everybody. Glad that this is now up and going. And I got the notification on my phone that it's up and going, so that means I want it to. It's nice when things go the way that they're supposed to. Welcome back for another week of our study of the Gospel of Matthew. Guess not terribly bad. We are now 8 at least. I could be off on my counting. I should have gone back and double checked, but I didn't. Now 8 weeks in, and we are just now finally getting to the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. I enjoy these sort of deep studies that kind of pull information from the setting and the culture and the audience into these conversations, and we're definitely going to be doing more of that this week. A couple things that I want to do on the front end of class this evening by way of reminder. One, especially when we are looking at things like the Beatitudes, it is important for us to remember the nature not only of Jesus' audience who he spoke to, but also Matthew's audience and who he collected these sayings and organized them in a way for, to provide depth and meaning for his own purposes, in addition to what Jesus actually said, for his audience. And part of that is remembering who Matthew's audience was to begin with. So Matthew very likely writes to a predominantly Jewish church. Probably there are a few different places that could be. Antioch is kind of the most popular one, and I'm good with any of them, but it's a predominantly Jewish community who's facing some challenges, being rejected by the local synagogue community, the local Jewish community. And I think it's important for us to remember in all of this that the earliest Christians, Jewish Christians, did not understand themselves to be starting something new. Jesus was the Messiah that the prophets had spoken of. The work was in line with what God had always been doing. This was the fulfillment, certainly Matthew says that in about 1,000 different ways, of God's long, overarching work amongst the people. And so they didn't think they were starting something new. They weren't bailing on the synagogues and on the temple. There's a reason in the book of Acts you see the earliest Christians continuing to go through life at the temple. They were there teaching and participating in worship practices and all of those things on a regular basis. They weren't doing something new. This was the fulfillment of something very old. And so Matthew's community is still trying to be a part of what they've always been a part of, because that is where they have found God, where they have experienced God, where they've learned faith, and they're finding themselves no longer welcome in those circles and trying to figure out what to do with that. And that becomes, I think, a kind of key point of understanding for us as we look at the Beatitudes themselves. So Matthew chapter 5, we'll be looking at verses 1 through 12 tonight, though especially focusing on 3 through 12. Matthew, gives us these blessings. And I want to start just by talking about what a beatitude is and why it matters that Jesus' extended Sermon on the Mount here begins with these beatitudes. What you see on the screen in front of you right now, Discipleship Begins with Perspective, points to what these beatitudes are. What Jesus does is offer blessings on people who see in a different way. That's a broad way to say that, but that's what's going on here. And as you work your way through these one at a time, which we will do here in a few minutes, what we are looking at is ways in which Jesus challenges his audience to perceive the world differently than what they have, what they or how they are told to. He offers a different perspective for daily life, different perspective on normal experiences that should help shape kingdom people. And And in doing so, what Jesus provides here is an introduction to the Sermon on the Mount as a whole. So these Beatitudes, this shifting perspective that Jesus invites his audience to, is in the way that Matthew organizes it, and the way that Jesus says it, and the way that we read it, the beginning of discipleship. It should not surprise us at all that discipleship begins with teachings on how we see ourselves, how we see each other, and how we see the world around us, because discipleship is interactive. Discipleship is how we live out our beliefs. Faith is not assent to claiming, agreeing with certain doctrinal positions. That's just agreeing with something. What it looks like lived out is what discipleship is, and that's what Jesus is pushing those who are listening towards. Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 and 2 introduces the setting and says, "One day, as he saw the crowds gathering, Jesus went up on the mountainside and sat down. His disciples gathered around him, and he began to teach them." And so we kind of have two layers of audience members. We have the disciples who are there, and then we have the crowds who are there. And I think those two different categories of people serve as a good kind of juxtaposition towards each other. There are people who hear, and then there are people who do. And that is essentially the starting point. And by giving these teachings, Jesus is inviting the crowd to become disciples. He's calling them into something beyond just amazement at his miracles or being impressed with the power of his words. He's inviting them to a lived response to the work of God. Are they going to leave the crowds and become disciples? And I think for us, that's a good question for us to ask as we go through our daily lives, certainly, but also as we read the Sermon on the Mount, because it's going to issue forth some challenges that we do not always respond well to. And I think we are kidding ourselves if we don't take the time to process through this, if we just blindly assume that, well, I go to church and I like God, so obviously I'm a disciple. For Jesus, it's not that simple. It's much more challenging, and I think that makes it much more valuable, and that's kind of where the Sermon on the Mount goes. The other thing I want to point out is that there's nothing particularly new in any of these blessings that Jesus offers up. Beatitudes themselves are very common, especially throughout the Psalms, but not just in the Psalms. You see it in other poetic literature, like some of the prophetic oracles we get in Isaiah. Jeremiah provides some really beautiful ones too in the form of lament, but it's still very much the same idea. For what we're looking at tonight, Psalm 37 is extremely important, and in fact, I want to take just a minute to look at a few snippets of Psalm 37 to kind of help set the tone for what's in Matthew's audience, or Jesus's audience, Matthew's audience's ears when they hear these, because they would have known the Psalms backwards and forwards. Those are the prayer book of Israel. They were a part of daily life for the Jewish community, and so when Jesus makes these statements, their brain goes to places that ours doesn't, because we're not as intimately connected with the Psalms. And so here are just a few snippets of Psalm 37, and I believe that you will hear some of these. They'll feel very familiar once we start reading Matthew's Beatitudes. So chapter 37, Psalm 37, 3 and 4, trust in the Lord and do good, then you will live safely in the land and prosper. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you your heart's desires. Verse 11, the lowly will possess the land and live in peace and prosperity. Psalm 37, verse 22, those the Lord blesses will possess the land. In verse 27, turn from evil and do good, and you will live in the land forever. I did this out of line. I've already talked a little bit about a beatitude, what the Beatitudes are, but there's kind of a clear statement for where we're headed. It's a blessing, but blessings aren't just nice words. They are active encouragements. And in this case, on what it means to live in recognition of God's presence in our lives, what it means to live as if God is present in our lives. Maybe that's the other way to say it, because that comes with the recognition that God is. All right. So let's go ahead and dive into the Beatitudes themselves. Chapter 5, verse 3 of Matthew. God blesses those who are poor and realize their need for him, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. So obviously I'm working with a little bit different translation than what you're used to. What you would usually see here is blessed are those, and some of you, if you've got your Bibles open, probably have that in front of you, or that's what you're expecting to hear. I've got New Living Translation that I'm working from. And I think there are a number of ways that it does really good in the Beatitudes, but it's not as traditional, so it may not feel quite like what you're used to, and that's fine. Just roll with it for a minute. What you are probably used to seeing here in verse 3 is poor in spirit. And that has been misinterpreted by people for a very, very long time because we don't really understand what to do with that phrase. One of the things that we often miss is the ways in which these Beatitudes actually pair up with each other. If you learned much about poetry in school, you learned about A-B rhyme schemes and Jewish writing. Poetic writing is very much styled the same way, and you kind of have an A-B, C-D, C-D thing here for those of you lit majors for whom that will mean something to. If that's not you, then just ignore it and recognize that these Beatitudes pair with each other. They are repetitive. They build on each other. And I think it makes sense to read verse 3 in light of verse 5 and verse 5 in light of verse 3 because they're saying some of the same thing to try and help build the other one up. So then what do we mean by poor in spirit? Because what some have taken that to mean is people who are emotionally beat up, as if they're despairing. But that's not what Jesus means when he uses that phrase here. Instead, what Jesus means when he talks about poor in spirit here is more along the lines of humility. Poor in spirit means humble and not prideful. There's a recognition that you are not an island unto yourself. Poor in spirit is another biblical way of saying recognizing your dependency on God, or completely dependent on God. And so it recognizes God's necessity in your life. So blessed are those who recognize, I like the New Living Translation here, those who are poor and realize their need for him. Poor is if you read Luke's parallel passage in the Gospel of Luke, he drops the in spirit part and just says, blessed are the poor. And there are a few reasons for that. One, the Gospel of Luke is much more focused on the economic situation of those who are involved. Luke has a ton to say about money. But the word for poor here, while it definitely most commonly speaks of financial destitution, it also has more than just financial behind it. And so blessed are those who recognize that their resources are not enough to get them to God, that they cannot earn or buy or achieve their way into the kingdom of God. Blessed are those who recognize that it's God's work that matters and nothing else. I think those are all faithful ways of rendering this idea here. So poor in spirit points to a humility that recognizes that you're not all sufficient, that you are not a little God unto yourself. Blessed are those who recognize that they are completely reliant on God, I think is a way that I would phrase that one up. And then for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. And one of the things that's interesting as you read through this is there's always kind of, there are some of these where it's as if they have already attained something. There are some where the Beatitude makes it sound like there's something that you will get down the road. And I think that vagueness is intentional. Because I think if you live this way, then certainly what you are doing is living out a kingdom life. Like you are living the way that a member of the kingdom of heaven should live. But it also recognizes that there is something that comes from God down the road, too. So it's kind of a both and thing, I think, is how I would tend to read that. All right. Verse 4. God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Mourning is not a popular experience in our world, and I've talked about this before, but one of the ways that it just shows up culturally for us in the United States specifically, or us in the West in general, is that just think about the whole funeral industry that's cropped up. We've commodified death in a way that we are no longer participants in the burial of those who are around us, even those that we're closest to. We might do some planning, but it's kind of hands-off. It used to be that our homes had parlors, and when somebody passed, they would, be in the parlor of the home, and there would be a time of mourning there. You might stay up with the dead. Hold wake would be Jewish tradition, but this certainly existed in Protestant traditions as well. And as we had funeral homes and moved that away from the house, we ceased to call our parlors parlors, and we started calling them living rooms, which is just, a bit on the nose. All of that to point out that culturally, especially, we do not like mourning. We do not like death. One of the jokes that Jerry Seinfeld did back in the 90s was talking about what people were afraid of. And the second greatest fear that people had in the survey that he was reading off of was death. The first one was public speaking. His joke there was that if you were at a funeral, you'd rather be in the coffin than the one having to give the eulogy. But that is kind of how we feel about this whole topic. We try to avoid mourning. We postpone death as long as possible, and we postpone conversations around it even further. And so when we think about the idea of mourning, finding blessing in mourning, that can be a real challenge. And yet, that is exactly what Jesus says here. Blessed are those who mourn. So what on earth is the blessing that we can find in mourning? I think that's a question worth asking and a question worth answering. In mourning, we admit that we are deeply connected to others. If we were not connected, there would be no need for mourning. And yet, the pain and sadness that we feel reminds us of that connection, which is a gift from God. That's not a bad thing to remember, even when we are hurting, or maybe especially when we are hurting. In mourning, we are not alone. We are comforted by those who are around us, and connected to those who mourn with us. Even though when somebody passes away, we are each and every one of us connected to them in a different way. We have some different memories. We have different natures of relationship. That mourning reminds us that we're together. And then the other thing that I would like to point out is we talk about it in connection to death very often, but that's not the only thing that should be mourned, and certainly not the only thing that's in mind of Jesus when he says this. We mourn far more than death, or at least we should. Mourning recognizes, just in general, the world is not as God designed it, as God wants it. So other things to be mourned. We mourn for abuse victims. We mourn for those who have been disadvantaged, taken advantage of by an inequitable economic system. We mourn the suffering of ourselves and others, whether that's due to physical illness and hardship or experiential mental health challenges. Like, those are all things that we mourn. And again, in mourning those things, we should find ourselves connected to others, because mourning those things requires of us a different perspective. And a different lived experience. It's hard to mourn an inequitable economic system if you're the beneficiary of it and have no desire to see it ended. Being able to step back and recognize The evil that is structured into our world is an important thing. And it is a change in perspective that we are called to. All right, verse 5, chapter 5. God blesses those who are humble, for they will inherit the whole earth. The word that's translated there, whole earth, is the exact same word for land, which should push you back to Psalm 37. We've translated it different in, these two places, but the Greek word here and the Greek word that's, from the Septuagint, Psalm 37, say the same thing. It's talking about the land. And so you can think about that and what it means for the people of Israel who long for their homeland under their control again. You can think about what it means as far as inheriting the whole earth. And again, I think both meanings are kind of intended here. You'll notice that verse 5 gives us again the image of humility, which is the same as 3 gave us. I think most translations that you'll have been used to here choose the word meek, and that's a really good translation. I know that there are people that have a difficult time with that word because of whatever it connotes in our time and our language, but it is a great word for any number of reasons, and it is a word that's used to describe both Moses in the book of Numbers and Jesus. Jesus uses it to describe himself and his own work in the book of Matthew twice. And it's a word that recognizes that there is power, but just because we have it doesn't mean we should use it selfishly. In fact, we definitely shouldn't use it selfishly. And so, my translation chooses humility. The image is very much the same. And if you want a passage in the Bible that gives you a perfect description of what the word meek here lived out looks like, just go to Philippians 2, 5 through 11. That's though being in very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be held on to, but instead he humbled himself, becoming, obedient to death, even death. Like, that's, I skipped a verse there, but yeah, that's that section. That's what it points to. And that's what this looks like lived out. And the blessing found in living that way is that we live out our recognition of God's ultimate power. We do not insist on having things our way, but leave room for the recognition that we are not always right. It puts power in the hands of God instead of insisting that we make it the way we want it to be. It is unselfish through and through, which is a very important image throughout Christian history for what Christians should be. Now, there are a lot of ways in which we haven't been that, and how we have chosen to use authority and influence that the church has held over the years, all points to some ways in which Christians have not been very Christian. But the Beatitudes contain that. Here on the front end of a conversation about discipleship and what it looks like lived out is a reminder that there's a difference between forcing the world to be the way we want it to be and sacrificing our way to that goal. And what Jesus chooses and what we are called to choose is the sort of selfless, sacrificial living, not the might makes right mentality that's so present in our world. I skipped ahead too far. Verse 6, God blesses those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. There's a lot that we can hunger and thirst for tonight. I am hungering for a steak. I do not have one. What Jesus is talking about here is not that, food type hunger, but that deep longing and desire, the type of thing that gnaws at you. We don't, for the most part, know a ton about hunger. That's not to say that it's not present. It certainly is in our towns and communities. But if you're the type of person who's got a technological device to listen to me talk about this, then the odds of you having gone an extended period of time not knowing where your next meal was coming from and whether or not it was there is relatively low. We live in an incredibly affluent world, even though we do a terrible job of looking out for the needs of others, and hunger certainly exists. What Jesus suggests here is that feeling, that longing, that I will die if I don't get it, thirst and hunger, experience from food, is how we should feel about the righteousness of God. And this passage is talking about our desires, and how what our appetite is for shapes what we live for. So again, another good reminder on the front end of this conversation about discipleship, that discipleship starts with wanting what God wants. Verse 7, God blesses those who are merciful, for they will be shown mercy. This is an especially challenging one, I think, because the word behind merciful is a much bigger idea than just like letting something go. It points in the Old Testament to a characteristic of God, an attribute of God. And so what Jesus has in mind is that ancient Hebrew idea that points to the very heart of God. It is a steadfast, compassionate, forgiving love that isn't dictated by the actions of others, which means it doesn't depend on it doesn't depend on how someone treats you. It's not a quid pro quo relationship. Blessed are those who continually choose, and then I put together a string of words there that all fill towards the Hebrew meaning. Love, kindness, compassion, forgiveness, mercy, in spite of the actions of others. And I think that's where we have the challenge, is those, the last few words there. It's really easy to be good to the people who are good to us. But we allow ourselves to badmouth and insult and demean and other people who are not nice to us. And in doing so, we then are in no way different from the person that we think is so utterly horrible. We're doing the exact same things they are. And, that sort of perspective shift is one the modern church desperately needs. We like our Christianity as a set of beliefs that we say we agree with much more than we like it as a lived response towards those who are around us, no matter how they treat us. And yet, with this statement about the merciful here, that's exactly what Jesus is saying. Blessed are those who love steadfastly in spite of whatever's happening to them, including those that it's being done by. Which is going to be a key component to a beatitude here in just a few minutes. Verse 8 first. God blesses those whose hearts are pure, for they will see God. This beatitude points towards Psalm 24. And what Psalm 24 talks about is those who can enter into the temple and who can enter into worship. Purity in modern religious language often has to do with sexual immorality, which is not what the psalmist or Jesus has in mind here. Instead, it's pointing to the totality of dedication, the whole devotion of the person. And you'll notice how many of these things point to deeply desiring God above everything else. In many ways, they are all that, just said in different ways. Or for the most part, that's kind of how it frames up. And so we are again reminded that how we view the world around us, the people around us, matters deeply. Verse 9, God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called the children of God. Peace here is not just the absence of violence or war. The Jewish idea of peace is shalom, a word that you've probably heard before, but that word doesn't just mean peace. It doesn't just mean quiet. It doesn't, just mean an absence of violence or whatever. It really means the fullness of God's intentions, the well-being of everything that God created, which is a huge idea. And so really what this says is not blessed are those who don't, start a fight with somebody else. Saying is blessed are those who work towards the wholeness of God's intentions, who right injustices in God's name. Blessed are those who endeavor to bring the world into alignment with God's designs. So often these people are called troublemakers. Elijah, somebody who definitely worked to bring about the wholeness of God's intention, is called by Ahab a troublemaker of Israel. Elijah would have disagreed with that title, but that's certainly how he's seen by others around him. And I think he serves as a good image of what it looks like to be dedicated to the shalom work of God, the peacemaking work of bringing Israel in line with God's intentions. So again, it's not just not being argumentative, it's what you're working towards. And sometimes that's going to bring about some conflict. All right, verse 10, God blesses those who are persecuted for doing right, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Such an attitude towards persecution requires a mind that is focused on goals that are so incredibly divergent from what we've been handed culturally, where we're kind of coached, it's embedded into us, to desire comfort and power and popularity and wealth and all of those things. If that's what you care most about, then there is no persecution you will care to withstand. You'll check out from the very beginning because it's not worth it. The other thing I want to point out here is we seem to have a pretty big misunderstanding about what persecution is. Persecution is not getting our way, and it's not having people disagree with us. But for so much of our American cultural history, the church saw very little pushback. Now, when we get some pushback, we call that persecution, and our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world that experience actual persecution would beg to disagree. In fact, I think they would love to experience a little more of what we call persecution and a little less of what they actually experience. And the fact that we have such a hard time understanding, such a hard time tolerating even just pushback, does not speak well for our ability to handle actual persecution. I'm trying to think of the right way to try and describe this, and maybe the best way to do it is just, we'll go ahead and do verses 11 and 12, because this is really what serves as an explainer for those verses, and it's important to remember exactly who Matthew is writing to. Verses 11 and 12, God blesses you when people mock you and persecute you and lie about you and say all sorts of evil things against you because you're my followers. Be happy about it. Be very glad. For a great reward awaits you in heaven, and remember the ancient prophets were persecuted in the same way. The comment about the ancient prophets really brings it home. Plenty of those prophets were put to death. Many were imprisoned. They were physically assaulted and beaten repeatedly. And by pointing to the prophets, that kind of shows us exactly what Jesus has in mind. And I would say what is, if not happening, then at least on the horizon for Matthew's church community. Because they are experiencing a significant pushback during the time that Matthew writes down this gospel. We know that Jewish persecution of early Jewish Christians, a la Paul, was often violent and deadly, and we know that there was plenty of it, especially in and around Judea. Though Paul experiences pushback from Jewish communities in Asia Minor and in Greece. So it certainly exists in those places. Now, I do want to point out that persecution in general for the early church, it was very rare for there to be some widespread government organized persecution of the church. It comes up sporadically in different locations, but in fact, the only time in Roman history where there was a empire-wide campaign against Christians was actually in the year 300. So a few hundred years after Jesus, where it was Roman policy to do something about the churches, about Christians. Before then, you'd see it sporadically pop up here or there. It certainly existed, but it wasn't necessarily on the scale that we often think of it happening. Not that that's a huge here or there. I just want you to have a little bit of that history when you think about this. The you here that Matthew uses, because God blesses those, God blesses those, God blesses those, God blesses you. I think it sets up what comes next. The rest of the Sermon on the Mount, you are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world. You have heard it said, it becomes very personal. So it helps kind of transition that. It also invites people into discipleship. Jesus is not just talking about those. He's talking to somebody, and what do I need to be one of those somebodies? How do I become a you? How do I become a disciple? But for Matthew's audience, that's an important word too, because their you is deeply personal. They are this Jewish community, likely in Antioch, who's experienced rejection of the rest of the Jewish community in their city. They're a persecuted people. They are experiencing some of those rejections from the place where they have always called home. And that's got to be especially hard when it's, your family, your people, your tradition who are your persecutors. It's not some other, it's your neighbor, and what do you do with that? So that you carries some meaning for, Matthew's audience, who is very much experiencing this type of rejection. And, that in itself is an encouragement. Jesus saw this coming. It wasn't going to be comfort. It wasn't going to be, sunshine and daisies and an easy life. There's a price to pay. And if you value God above everything else, you will pay it. And if you don't, then you won't. And that's kind of the beginning of discipleship. It's a question of whether or not it's worth it. So I think that is a good spot to wind down this evening. Again, these Beatitudes serve as an introduction to the Sermon on the Mount. They are... They serve as the requirements for discipleship, a perspective on the world that where you view the world as God does is the beginning of genuine discipleship, and it has no substitutes. There are no levels. You're in or you're out, and that should be very challenging to us. It is too easy to just automatically assume that we're in because we grew up with it or because we've said the right prayer or we were baptized in the right place. But there's a heart transformation that's expected. And if that heart transplant hasn't happened, if you're wondering why your faith feels shallow, if that's you, one, please talk to me. Let's continue that conversation. Two, let's start with perspective. Think about how you've talked about others this week. Think about what you've expected from the world. Think about what you've bought and what it says about you value. Think about how you've spent your time. Ask questions of all of those things. Because if it points out that your desires are for something else, that your focus and attention is elsewhere, then that's where we need to start the conversation. And we need to start learning to desire what God desires. All right. I have run quite long. Sorry that I have gone longer than I wanted to, but this is an important foundational starting point for the Beatitudes, and that's everything I've got for you this evening. We'll build up from that next week. All right, glad